On this day in history, November 12th, 1912, British explorer Robert Falcon Scott's body and diary are found in Antarctica. Robert Falcon Scott came from a military family, and he began his own military career at age 13. By age 21, he had been promoted to lieutenant. Now, Robert Falcon Scott has to be one of the more badass names I've ever heard, so I'm just going to call him Falcon. When Robert Falcon agreed to lead the Antarctic expedition, he was less motivated by science and polar exploration and more motivated by career and financial ambitions. His first expedition took about 3 years, and it wasn't unsuccessful, but he really wasn't liked by his fellow explorers and crew. Something about him just rubbed people the wrong way. Maybe he was a little too arrogant, he was probably a little pushy. I mean, he was a military guy in a room full of scientists. They didn't exactly appreciate having him around, let alone having him lead the expedition. But when he returned to Britain, he was considered a public hero. For about a year, he toured around Britain giving lectures and publishing his diary. In early 1906, he put in a bid for a second expedition to Antarctica to return to his old base camp. But to his dismay, his rival and frenemy, Ernest Shackleton, had already announced plans for his own return. Falcon and Shackleton wrote a series of sassy, maybe flirty, letters back and forth, each demanding that the other find a different place to work. That rain's getting real bad. As I said, Falcon was a handful. He didn't exactly know public relations. He wasn't really good with people. And he had an enormous sense of self-importance. He once wrote to a bookshop complaining that one of their books gave equal credit to Falcon and Shackleton for the first exploration. So Shackleton eventually agreed to work an acceptable distance away from Falcon's territory, but he couldn't end up keeping the promise because when he arrived to Antarctica, he claimed there was no other safe place to land. Historians later criticized Falcon for his possessiveness, claiming that it should have never been demanded. When Shackleton returned from the Antarctic, having never successfully found the pole, Falcon slapped himself on the ass and said, "All right, you're up, buddy." Falcon realized this was his chance, and he proceeded with his second attempt to find the South Pole. The Royal Geographical Society, which was funding this trip, requested that Falcon's primary objective be science. But just like Lady Gaga, Falcon was all like, "I live for the applause, applause, applause." So Falcon began to assemble his team. He sent his dog expert to go get horses, and he sent his horse guy to go get dogs. Then he hired Shackleton's motor expert to strap a motor on the back of every one of them. As Falcon begins to make his way south, he receives a telegram from another polar explorer, Roland Amundsen, that said, "South Pole or bust, bitch." And the race was on. The caravan of motorized dogs, ponies, and scientists all set off in different groups, traveling at different rates, designed to support the final group of men who would make a dash for the pole. This is what I think the plan looked like. Okay, so let's say over here is the ship with the supplies. This is where the crew gets off. And over here is the South Pole. So let's say there are 4 teams, with the fourth and final team being the polar team. Team number 1 takes off first with their supplies, and they go as far as they can. Team number 2, also carrying supplies, goes to a second point. Team number 3, also carrying supplies, heads out. And finally, team number 4, the polar team, takes off last. I'm just guessing. I never saw a map of this. I didn't see an illustration or a demonstration. I'm just guessing. So team number 1 leaves their goodies here and heads back. Team number 2 leaves their goodies here and heads back. Team number 3 leaves their goodies here and heads back. Team number 4 picks up goodies here. They pick up the goodies there, and they pick up the goodies there, and they continue on to the North Pole, South Pole, South Pole, getting refueled and resupplied along the way. Now, maybe team number 3, who traveled the shortest distance, when they return back, they just restock and they head out again to meet the returning explorers on their way back. In theory, team number 2, maybe they also resupply and head out to meet them at a different point when they come back. So the fourth team that's coming back has a supply drop and fuel supplies and all the things they need along the way at each one of these points that the people are supposed to be leaving supplies at. Does that make sense, right? I think that's about it. Before the chosen polar group made up of Falcon, 5 men, and 0 ponies marched on, Falcon reminded the Surgeon Lieutenant Atkinson of the order to take 2 dog teams south to meet them as they were returning. On the 17th of January, Falcon reached the South Pole, only to find a tent left by Edmundson and a letter dated the 18th of December. Son of a bitch. Falcon's anguish is indicated in his diary, where he writes, "The worst has happened. All daydreams must go. Good God, this is an awful place." 2 days later, the group made the 862-mile return journey. The party made good progress despite poor weather and completed the first 300 miles in just under 2 weeks. In the following days, as Falcon's group made a 100-mile descent down Beardmore Glacier, the physical condition of Falcon's men deteriorated. Still needing to travel 400 miles across the Ross Ice Shelf, the prospects of Falcon's party steadily worsened as they struggled northward, dealing with increasingly bad weather, a puzzling lack of fuel at the supply stops, hunger, and exhaustion. Meanwhile, back at base camp, the ship had returned with fresh supplies. Atkinson, remember, that guy, decided to unload supplies with his own men rather than return with the dog teams as ordered by Falcon. When Atkinson finally did leave for the planned rendezvous with Falcon, he encountered the scurvy-ridden Teddy Evans. Oh, Teddy. Who needed urgent medical attention. Teddy must have been from one of the other teams that was coming back in stages. Atkinson tried to send an experienced navigator to go in his stead while he tended to Eddie, feeding lemons and limes and oranges. But the chief meteorologist said, he needed that guy to stay back and work. So instead, Atkinson had to send a short-sighted man named Cherry Gerard, who could only navigate as far as he could see, ensuring that they would never meet Falcon in time at the agreed-upon spot. Meanwhile, Falcon had reached the rendezvous point 3 days ahead of schedule, and he was feeling pretty good. When the agreed-upon meeting date came and left, Falcon decided to press on, hoping that he would meet the returning dog team on the way. Falcon's team of 5 human men were down to just 3, one having fallen multiple times and succumbing to his injuries, and the other, suffering from severe frostbite, voluntarily left the tent one day, saying, "I'm just going out for a stroll. I may be some time." He never returned. Alive. After walking another 20 miles north, despite Falcon's toes now becoming severely frostbitten, the 3 remaining men made their final camp on March 19th, just 12.5 miles short of the 1-ton depot where the ship and the rest of the crew were waiting. Over the next 9 days, as their supplies ran out and storms continued to rage on outside the tent, Falcon and his companions wrote their farewell letters. His final diary entry was written on March 29th, with its concluding words, "Last entry. For God's sake, look after our people." He is presumed to have died on March 29th, 1912, or possibly the day after. The bodies of Falcon and his companions were discovered by a search party 8 months later. The positions of the bodies indicate that Falcon was probably the last one to die. Next to their bodies lay 35 pounds of Glossopteris tree fossils, which they had drug along with them the whole way. These were the first ever discovered fossils that proved that Antarctica used to be warm and connected to other continents. At first, Falcon was regarded as a hero. In his diary, he had written what he called his message to the people, which said, "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance." Hardihood? Had we lived, I would have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. However, later he was considered a bungler. People kept using that word to describe him, saying that he never should have been leading these expeditions, and that the only reason he was ever considered a hero was to bolster Britain at the beginning of the First World War. Give him kind of something to feel good about. So anyway, that's Robert Falcon Scott. These polar explorations are no joke. Not for me. Not for me.